saying that I'm not focused on fighting anymore and I want to do the movies and all that bull. But, you know, yeah, that stuff's going to be there in the future, of course.
Continues to tee up. Oh, a left by Shamrock. A left by Shamrock. And that will slow Tito down.
Taking the initiative. If this just continues for 15 minutes, Tito wins the fight on the decision.
He's hurt there again. That right hand to the temple, on the chin again.
This is the pay-per-view, and they're just going to show it on regular TV, right? Yeah. Until you can.
Good shot.
And again, are they the most damaging shots in the world?
Goes from St. Pierre.
You heard him bad.
Number 10. Tito Ortiz. The feud between the former light heavyweight champ and Dana White is one of the ugliest in the history of MMA. Both parties exchange words where, if MMA wasn't $1 billion business, bridges would be left behind in ashes. Dana White called Ortiz one of the most dishonest human beings I've ever met. Ortiz famously wore a t-shirt reading, "Dana is my bitch" at the weigh-ins to UFC 84. Ortiz actually showed his contract off to other fighters in order to soften the UFC's negotiation strength, costing the promotion millions.
Like I said, Tito and I probably need to sit down and talk.
Do you want Tito in the UFC?
Yeah, listen, when we do that, we'll see what happens.
Ortiz would eventually return to the UFC, and once again, the bitterness between the two was buried by the memories of the good old days, where they skipped through meadows hand in hand. Once again, this sense of camaraderie ended after the fighter started a new job that put him at odds with the UFC. Number 9. Randy Couture. Randy Couture became the UFC's third heavyweight champion in 1997, beating Maurice Smith at UFC Japan. He would never defend the belt, leaving the UFC over a contract dispute and taking his talents to Japan.
As soon as his big toe steps out of that cage, he's the furthest thing from it. The only time that Randy Couture is ever a man is when he steps foot in that cage.
He would return to the UFC in 2001 and stuck around until 2007. From here, Couture's history with the UFC was whitewashed hard, as his retirement fight with Lyoto Machida came and went. He was remembered as the grizzled veteran who was great enough to have 5 different belts strapped around his waist. Now attached to Bellator, he finds himself once again butting heads with Dana White. These days, it's a lot easier to remember his fights with the UFC out of the cage than his fights with the UFC in the cage. Number 8. Ken Shamrock. Ken Shamrock, at one point or another, committed nearly every one of these offenses thus far. Allying himself with competing promotions? Check. Litigious contract dispute with the UFC? Check. Taking issue with Dana White personally? Check. The one thing that puts Shamrock securely in the number 1 spot as Dana White's most hated fighter, though.
Frank Shamrock's a dick. You know what I mean? Frank Shamrock literally never shuts up. The guy is a clown. I just have no respect for Frank Shamrock. That's the difference, you know? Frank Shamrock came out with a statement the other day, he wants to fight me. You know what I mean? Give me a fucking break.
Was his appearance on an ESPN Outside the Line special on UFC Fighter Pay. Number 7. Quinton Rampage Jackson. Quinton Rampage Jackson and Dana White are, in many ways, 2 peas in a pod. The thing is, as anybody who dormed with their at the time best friend sophomore year knows, peas can get really mad with each other after they spend extended periods of time together. Jackson has always been a bit of a prima donna and has rarely reacted well to adversity.
Can you make a lot of money in MMA?
You can. I did pretty well in my MMA career. Top MMA fighters, we make more money than regular boxers, but it's only 1% of the boxers in the world making money anyway. But at the same time, I think that, you know, I wish we made it as much as the top boxers.
It wasn't hard then to leave UFC.
No, it wasn't. It was very easy for me to leave UFC.
This, of course, made his role in the light heavyweight division difficult to pin. Was he the sort of wily fan favorite Matt Serra was when he fought Matt Hughes and Frank Trigg? Or was he a legitimate title contender? The UFC at least believed him to be the latter, and as he began losing to younger, better fighters, he became more and more eccentric. Worse than all that, however, was pulling out of a scheduled UFC 107 matchup with Rashad Evans following following The Ultimate Fighter Season 10. The event was built around Jackson and took place in his hometown of Memphis. Even though White has been a sport since Jackson's final UFC fight at UFC on Fox 6, he says there's no bad blood. It's tough to believe that. Number 6. Tyron Woodley. UFC welterweight champion Tyron Woodley took exception to criticism leveled against him by UFC President Dana White regarding his victory over Demian Maia at UFC 214 on Saturday in Anaheim, California. Woodley said that, "If you're going to publicly scrutinize me, Dana White, he needs to apologize to me. I've done nothing but good stuff for the sport."
It takes a lot to please you.
It's not. Just treat me fairly. I don't need any above and beyond, but I want to be treated fairly.
Has it gone better though? Still not feeling that it's fair.
In general, that's all. If you want to please me, treat me fairly. I don't need any extra attention.
"I've done nothing but be a good role model for the organization." That sounded serious, didn't it? While Woodley retained his title in a unanimous decision, White thought the champion should have sealed the victory much earlier. White wasn't the only one who looked at Woodley's performance with a critical eye. Bleacher Report's Scott Harris listed the 35-year-old as one of his losers from UFC 214, arguing Woodley's conservative approach and dominance over Maia hurt the entertainment of the bout. After the fight, Woodley said the shoulder injury prevented him from putting together a better striking display, telling reporters the shoulder slipped out in the first or second round. Number 5. George St. Pierre. At the end of his title fight with Johnny Hendricks, George St. Pierre was not right in the head, already looking like he'd repeatedly run his face into a wall. St. Pierre showed an even scarier sign of the damage he had sustained. After the fight, which St. Pierre won by virtue of a controversial decision, the distraught welterweight mentioned this incipient brain damage, admitting to having lost time in the cage that night, struggling to put his words together, even apologizing to announcer Joe Rogan at one point. The champion seemed close to a breaking point. To say UFC promoter Dana White didn't take this news particularly well is an understatement of somewhat epic proportions. White was furious, directing his anger at the Nevada State Athletic Commission. Reporters who scored the fight for St. Pierre,
"You see it from my perspective of view, I'm making a lot of money now, even though I'm not fighting. My contract is old now because if I go back and fighting, I cannot advertise my sponsor, and so I'm losing money if I go back to fight on the old."
And even the champion himself, despite St. Pierre's clear personal and physical struggles, White had only one thing on his mind: getting his unraveling champion back in the cage. Number 4. John Jones. John Jones lobbying for more pay from the UFC is nothing new. In recent times, the former light heavyweight champion has gotten more vocal about it though, and earlier this week threw out a number of $8 million being too little to fight new heavyweight champ Francis Ngannou. But even going back to 2020, Jones told the Steve O's Wild Ride podcast why he thinks he has to be more vocal about his pay. On that episode, Jones said doesn't feel like he was wanted in the UFC by Dana White and that he would fight elsewhere if he was released from his contract. After Ngannou beat Stipe Miocic to win the heavyweight belt at UFC 260, Jones started talking about his financial hopes with the UFC. He posted long streams of Twitter messages about his dispute, which essentially boils down to the former light heavyweight champion wanting a better contract to move up in weight. And that has been nothing new, even before Ngannou had the belt. Number 3. Chris Cyborg Justino. In 2019, Chris Cyborg Justino's UFC contract was up, but she was not ready to resign. She needed a public apology from UFC President Dana White first. Cyborg, fresh off her win against Felicia Spencer at UFC 240, said on ESPN that she needs White to apologize for years of bullying against her.
"You look UFC, who's the face UFC? Dana White. All the time then try to damage my brand, especially Dana White. You know, he's the head. Continue damage my brand. He's damaged a long time ago, you know, like start when I was in Strike Force. But he's continued doing this. I was just prove prove he's wrong.
White and Justino have been feuding for years, most notably starting in 2014 when he publicly compared her to male fighter Vanderlei Silva in a dress and heels in a media conference. Cyborg tweeted out a video pairing both White's comments from 2014 and Rogan's podcast from 2015 on Monday afternoon too, and added a very clear message around harassment that women face in workplaces. Number 2. Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz isn't happy about his treatment at the hands of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and he's not going to take it anymore. Diaz is one of the most popular fighters in the lightweight division, that's a fact. But he's also displaying a fundamental misunderstanding of how the UFC rankings work. The UFC isn't weeding him out of the top 10. The UFC doesn't create its rankings. They vote on a large number of media. It must be tough to see Melendez with his shiny new contract that makes him one of the highest paid athletes in the sport. But the fact that Diaz has lost 2 of his last 3 fights leaves him very little space to demand a contract renegotiation. UFC President Dana White told Helwani there's only one way for Diaz to fix his money issues. He needs to fight. Like it or not, this makes sense. We believe fighters should make more money, but sitting on the sidelines and complaining won't do any good.
Should have Mike Tyson handing out a belt if anybody. I didn't give a about no belt anyway, but The Rock too, man. That motherfucker over here playing me. See him over here smiling with Masvidal? He could get it too.
Nate, as far as the fight itself with Leon, I mean...
If Diaz needs money, he should get back in the cage. If he believes he's worth more than he's currently making, he needs to prove it with his performances. Number 1. Ben Askren. Stop me if you've heard this one before. Dana White doesn't like somebody, and he doesn't mind telling anyone who will listen exactly what he thinks. He's engaged in public spats with folks for years. Nobody is safe. Other promoters, television network officials, and even his own fighters. If you piss White off, there's a very good chance he'll tell everybody about it. Now, White has a new favorite target.
Ben Askren, he went to ONE FC. That meeting that you had with him, why was he unable to sell you on why you should be in the UFC?
I mean, for me, the biggest benefit is not having to work for Dana White. That guy's a freaking scumbag.
Obviously I heard that he had a lot of negative things to say, especially about me. I can just tell from the comments that were made that Ben Askren just isn't one of those kind of guys. He's not a guy.
Ben Askren, the former Bellator welterweight champion. Things calmed down for a while, and White even admitted last week he'd be willing to take a second look at Askren. But then Askren appeared on Inside MMA last week and put White on blast, saying he could have a successful career even if he never signs with the UFC. Yes, Askren was responding to the baffling line of questioning from host Kenny Rice, but he still insulted White. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.